Can you hear me? Okay, I think the audio is working. If it's not working, please raise your hand so we can check if resets. So thank
It is working.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. So thank you all for joining today. Today we're going to discuss the protecting human rights globally, challenges and responses. Let me just check if we can remove this. Yeah, so thank you all for joining today's class. Today we're going to discuss firstly, what are human rights? Oh, the screen is going a bit fast. To the next one. Today we're going to discuss, first of all, what are human rights, and they are fundamental to the dignity and well-being of every individual. And today we will explore the challenges faced in protecting human rights globally and the responses to these challenges. And why is this such an important topic? Because it actually is a right for every human being in the world, no matter where you're born, no matter your gender, religion, or your sexual orientation. And every day it's a big challenge to respect and defend those rights. So our goal for today's lecture is to raise awareness and to promote action towards safeguarding the rights of all people. And the learning objectives are to understand the importance of human rights and their impact on individuals, but also on the societies you are living in. By the end of the class, I hope you're able to identify the key challenges in protecting human rights globally, explore the different approaches and responses to these challenges, and discuss the role of individuals, organizations, and governments in protecting human rights, and also what you can do to promote these. If you have any question, please feel free to reach out, because this is a more interactive class. Let's try to fix this first. It's going quite fast down. So first of all, I would like to give you a brief overview of what human rights are. Human rights are basically fundamental rights and freedoms that everyone has. So everyone is entitled to the same human rights, regardless of your nationality, race, religion, or gender. And the idea is that we all have these, regardless of where we are born or who we are. So we are all entitled to the same basic rights and freedoms, no matter who you are. If you are from South Africa or the Netherlands or New Zealand, we all have the same basic rights and freedoms. It might not seem so because of the governments and how people are treated all over the world, or especially during times of war, but we are entitled to the same basic rights, and unfortunately, it's not the same in practice. So these rights are all inherent to all human beings, and they are protected by international law. So human rights are not a privilege, and they cannot be revoked. That means they cannot be withdrawn. Human rights should be universal, and they are inalienable. You will receive a copy of this PDF file after the presentation, so please be aware, and if you have questions, reach out, but you don't have to take too many notes. I think if I will make it smaller, then maybe it will go slower. I'm not sure if you can see the screen well this way. So what are a few key human rights? I'm going to name a few examples. I think you are familiar with those. The first one is the right to life, the right to be protected from arbitrary deprivation of life. Freedom of speech, that means you have the right to express your opinion and your ideas freely. The right to equality, that means the right to be treated equally and without discrimination. We all have the rights of freedom of religion. That means the right you have to practice any religion or belief freely. That doesn't mean you can suppress other people to have the same religion as you want to explore. The right to education, that means you have the right to access quality education. So even in countries, for example, like Asian countries or the Middle East before, where women were not entitled to follow education, they have the human right to actually follow education. Another one is the right to health. You all have the right to access healthcare and live a healthy life. In some countries, this is quite difficult because some governments, they require you to have a health insurance before they will allow to help you in hospital. But that doesn't mean you are not entitled to the rights of healthcare access and a healthy life. We all also have the right to privacy. That means you have the right to privacy and protection of personal information. Like we discussed before, for example, to data protection and the personal data you share by using the internet, or maybe when you start up an e-commerce company and you request the data of users, then the question is, how will you protect the customer data and their personal information? Because it should be protected, because they have the right to have protection of their personal data. Another one, which is a very important one, is the right to a fair trial. Unfortunately, this right is not honored in all of the countries worldwide, but we do have the right to a fair trial. That means that you should have a trial which is governed by impartial judges, and it shouldn't be corrupt either. The evidence should be from a professional perspective be brought in. It should be fair and impartial. And this is very important. Why? Because it basically is trying to prevent you from being put into prison without any valid legal grounds. So this is a very important one. I hope none of us will ever have to deal with this, of course, but you should be aware of your rights. So I wonder, with the following major human rights violations, if you are able to name a few examples per item, because the following items still occur on a daily basis, unfortunately. So first we will discuss the violations briefly, so you understand what it says here. So the first one is torture and cruel treatment. That basically means that you are treated in an inhuman way in prison, for example. That can include physical and psychological abuse. Another one is arbitrary detention, which means unlawful imprisonment without due process or legal justification. That one is related to the human rights we just discussed before, the right to a fair trial. A third example is forced labor and slavery. That means exploitation of individuals through forced labor and human trafficking. Also, this still happens in different countries. Unfortunately, human trafficking, for example, related to children, or prostitution, or, for example, people who are kidnapped and put in big apartments and they are forced to labor for more than 12 hours a day. Another example is discrimination and racism. Also, this still happens and occurs on a global level. That means systematic marginalization and unequal treatment based on race or ethnicity. One of the last examples is violence against women, which means gender-based violence, including domestic violence and sexual assaults. This, of course, can be against much more different type of people. For example, gender bias or sexual orientated biases, or well, basically anyone that would like to use violence again. But usually it's based upon sexual grounds, or could be domestic based as well. Another human rights violation is suppression of freedom of expression. This is a very important one, and it still happens quite a lot, for example, in China. This means censorship or harassment or imprisonment of journalists. For example, journalists who criticize the government, they could be put into prison for invalid legal grounds. People who are activists, who promote human rights, and dissidents. So I was wondering, can you maybe name examples for the items we just discussed before? Where do human rights are violated on a global level? Or maybe you actually experienced one of these. You can raise your hand or answer maybe in the chat. I will give you a minute to think about it. A very important one we just discussed is, for example, China. I don't hear anyone else yet. Well, if nobody has any answer, then we'll get back to this later on. So I suggest we continue with the explanation of the role of different international bodies. There are many different international bodies, and one of the first one is the United Nations. This is a very important one. And the UN has been established in 1945, basically after the Second World War, and it promotes and protects human rights globally through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and various treaties and conventions. The United Nations has actually 17 different agencies. It's quite a big organization and it's one of the most important ones on a global level. Another one is the International Criminal Court. This court has been established in 2002 and it investigates and prosecutes individuals responsible for war, crimes against humanity, and genocides. Over 100 countries are agreed to participate. It's located in The Hague, in the Netherlands. And they're quite often in the news, so I think you are aware with them. Another one is Amnesty International. Amnesty International is a very important, big organization. They have been established a bit later than World War II, and they advocate for human rights. They conduct research and they expose human rights abuses worldwide. It's a world-leading human rights organization to prevent and fight against abuses. Another one is the Human Rights Watch. Human Rights Watch is a smaller organization and they also monitor human rights practices. They investigate abuse and they advocate for justice and accountability. They mainly document the stories and they detect and prevent and defend the human rights of people all over the world. And they are active in more than 100 countries. The last example, I think you have heard of them. They're basically the Red Cross and they provide humanitarian assistance and protection to victims of armed conflicts. And they promote respect for international humanitarian law. So these are only a few examples. If I will share later on the presentation with you, you can click on the name of the organization and you can watch a short video to have a bit more details per organization. So then the next step is to discuss the meaning of human rights. So I'm curious, what does the term human rights mean to you? And what rights do you think are most fundamental? Because human rights is a very it's a very important term, and still all of the countries in the world, we are still trying to discuss basically what should be interpreted under the definition of human rights and how can we protect these. So maybe you can share your thoughts with me today and tell me, what does the term human rights mean to you? And what rights do you think are most fundamental? I think if you unmute yourself, we might be able to hear you. So here we have one answer in the chat. Human rights are the 17 goals for sustainable development. Yeah, well, actually, sustainable development is a goal for human rights. That is correct. Why? Because sustainable development is also very crucial for the economic and also for the nature we are living in. So to create more sustainable energy, for example, is one of the goals on a global level. That's correct. Thank you for your answer. Anyone else has any idea or maybe can explain what the term human rights mean to you? So here we have another answer. The right to provide for food, clothing, and shelter. That is correct. And why is shelter so important? Because we all have the right to housing. That's true. We all have the right for food and clothing as well. Human rights are fundamental rights and freedoms that belong to every person, regardless of their nationality, ethnicity, gender, religion, or any other status. And these rights are actually inherent to all human beings and they are protected by law. That's correct. So here, one student is saying that they are universal, meaning they apply to everyone equally without discrimination. And they include civil and political rights, such as the right to life, liberty, and freedom of expression. That is very correct. It's actually very broad, right? Because the term human rights, they are documented in the Human Declaration, and there are different articles included, which we will discuss in a bit. And those rights do include like social rights, economic rights, cultural rights, and they include the right to education, health, and work. And they also refer to the right of speech and the right of freedom. Yeah, so all of these rights, thank you for your answers. That's very helpful. All of these rights are very important and they should be protected. And that doesn't mean it should be protected by only you, but also by the government in the jurisdiction you are living in, because they have the obligation to provide you protection and to protect and serve these rights as well in your jurisdiction. So I'm going to try to show you one of the videos to tell you more about the human rights. I need to change the screen. Let me see. I'm not sure if you can hear if I'll play, but let's check if it's working.
The Human Rights Council is the UN's main intergovernmental human rights forum. It's where individual states demonstrate to the rest of the world that they are committed to protecting human rights. It is also where countries discuss the most pressing human rights challenges and seek to work together to solve them. Through the Council, human rights defenders can bring about political pressure as a way to improve situations back home. The Human Rights Council was established in 2006. It meets 3 times a year in Geneva and is fundamental to the UN system. The Council consists of 47 states, elected by the 193 states in the General Assembly. Roughly a third of the members change each year. The Council tackles some of the worst human rights crises in the world. That could mean looking closely at a situation in one specific country, or considering issues that affect people all over the world. It facilitates discussion, encourages education, and, where necessary, holds rights violators to account. The power to create intense scrutiny makes the Human Rights Council a really important tool for defenders to use. It can adopt resolutions, or individual members can make statements pushing for the change that is needed. Through the Council, defenders can alert NGOs, the media, and the world in general to human rights violations in their home countries. Defenders can use the Council by coming to Geneva. That might mean taking an active role in sessions, delivering statements, planning side events, and meeting with representatives. But they can also shape the Council's agenda without leaving home, by lobbying for action or drawing attention to a situation on the ground. Any space in which different states come together will be unavoidably political. So human rights defenders must learn how to use those politics to their advantage. Defenders can use the agendas, alliances, and human rights commitments of individual states to get the Council to take action that will improve the lives of people around the world.
So thank you for your attention. This is basically a video about human rights and what we can do and how these are protected on a global level. So I will go back with you to the presentation. Does anyone have any question about the short video? No? Okay. Can you see the screen correctly? Okay, so we discussed the term human rights and we watched the short video. Now, my question to you is, if these rights are so important and they are protected on a global level, then what do you think makes them violated still on a daily basis? And what can we do about it? Because human rights, they represent a universal framework of standards and principles designed to safeguard the dignity and freedom and an inherent worth of every individual, irrespective of their nationality, place of residence, gender, etc. And these rights are fundamental, and still people are being suppressed or being discriminated on a daily basis, or censorship occurs. Do you maybe have any idea why the obligations of the governments are not fulfilled yet in accordance with human rights or the treaties on a global level? Do you have any ideas? If you don't have any idea, I will tell you. But you can think about it. One of the examples, which is a very straightforward example, is because all the states, they have different interests. A lack of goodwill, that is correct. Yeah. And why else would it be very important for a state, for example, to not protect all human rights? For example, the freedom of speech or freedom of religion. What could be the interest for the country? Well, one of them could, because they all have different interests for power. And it's also extremely difficult to enforce these rights because, first of all, it's difficult to universally enforce these rights because all states, they are self-governing. And secondly, it's very difficult to punish transgressors. So, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is a declaration. It's not a hard law itself. So it's not the law of the country you're living in itself. So when individuals violate these, the mechanisms are weak. And most of the organizations we discussed before today, they do investigate these and they report these, the incidents, and they speak with the authorities, but they cannot force the state to change a policy or to compensate a victim. And even if they would, it's still very hard to apply this. So first of all, it's because it's very difficult to universally enforce these rights. That's one of the problems. The second problem is to punish transgressors. A fourth problem could be the state interests. They all want to have the most power, or they want to earn more money in the end, and it's going to be very difficult to protect human rights accordingly because they all have different interests. So what factors enable these violations? Well, the difference, of course, per country. And it's a very difficult topic, and it's taking years to even get as far as we are today. and we have a lot of different international non-governmental organizations. But still, that doesn't mean all human rights are protected on a global level accordingly, unfortunately. So if we think about different examples of human rights violations, there are a few very important ones, and they have been in the news as well because they have been of major impact, unfortunately. One of them is the genocide in Myanmar. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but the Rohingya minority in Myanmar they have faced widespread persecution, including violence, displacements, and denial of citizenship, which is a very harsh impact. And they are considered to be one of the most persecuted minorities on the whole planet. A second example is the suppression of freedom of speech in China. And what happens there? The Chinese government, they basically heavily censor the internet. So, for example, apps like WhatsApp could not be allowed there, and the media is restricted to have freedom of expression or speech, and they suppress any dissenting voices. So, as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states, all people possess human rights and they all have fundamental freedoms that the government must protect. But like we have seen before, because different states have different interests, that doesn't mean they will comply with the human rights or the human rights laws. So the government of China, they are guided by a specific ideology under the absolute rule of a communist party, and they unfortunately they don't allow their citizens to express the same type of freedom we have, for example, in Western Europe. And people in China, they cannot practice a religion or belief of their choice either. They cannot express their opinions openly or form or join groups of their choosing without fear of harassment, arrest, or retribution. And members of minority groups are even subject to mass arbitrary detention, which is a very negative result, of course. They could also be even victim of torture or forced abortions or forced labor. So yeah, these things still happen on a global level. Another example could be discrimination and racism in the United States. We still see this happen on a daily basis as well. For example, cops who are still treating people whilst being racist or using violence against specific minorities or against gender or race. And of course, this is not legal, but it still happens, and it's very difficult to fight against because the balance between a cop and somebody who's being accused of a criminal offense is not equal at all. So if we go back to the history of how the human rights actually evolved, we can spend a whole other lecture about the history on human rights because it's quite a big topic, but for now I would like to discuss it briefly. But after World War II, or the Second World War, we had a global conflict, of course, and many human rights got violated. So what happened after the German invasion? The countries, they decided to create a treaty to reaffirm faith and fundamental human rights, which led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So if you click on this link later on, you can learn more about it. But basically, this treaty is about human rights. And rule number 1 is that all human rights are born free and equal in dignity and rights. There are in total about 30 articles, including the principle of non-discrimination and the right to life and liberty. And it also refers to negative freedoms. So what is a negative freedom? It's basically worded in the other way around. So for example, the freedom of torture as well as positive freedoms, which includes you have the rights of freedom of movement and the right to residence, which means housing. And furthermore, it states basic civil rights and political rights. These ones are one of the most important ones to create yourself as an individual, but also to create more awareness about what's going on in your country, for example. These rights include the freedom of expression, religion, or peaceful assembly, as well as social, economic, and cultural rights. So you can also think about the rights to follow education, and this means that anyone, and that shouldn't be based on their gender or their sexual preference or their age, for example, they all have the right to follow education, and they all have rights for an occupation as well. So the declaration basically doesn't take any side to which rights are more important. So there is not really any preference on which rights are more important, and nor is it supposed to be, because the human rights, they should be on a universal level determined, and they are indivisible and interdependent, which means you cannot split them up, and they are all very important, and they all should be protected in all the countries. So over the past decades, human rights are growing, and we're still trying to expand our understanding of what human rights are and how we can better protect them. Still, it's one of the most difficult topics on a global level to actually agree upon. And why? Because every human being is different, of course, which is a great thing, but we all also have different culture, different habits, different history. And it's also very difficult sometimes to meet in the middle or to agree upon what is a human right and what should be allowed in your country, and when is it not anymore a right, but when is it becoming a oppression, for example. So the next sheet is discussing the government obligations and the accountability. So I would like to ask you today, what obligations do governments have in upholding human rights for their citizens? And can you think of any example? So Samuel, I see you raised your hand. Can you please unmute yourself
Yes.
so we can hear you? Thank you.
Yeah, I would think of that all children in the country should have the right to go to school. That should be policy of the government.
Correct. The right to education, the right to follow
Yeah.
education. Correct. That is an obligation of the government to create schooling for children and the right to go to school as well. Thank you for your answer.
Sure.
Can you think of any other examples? We have the right to follow education. What could be other examples? For example, every day we are alive, right? We have the right to live as well, and we have the right for liberty. And the government should also, for example, prevent torture and a fair trial. So they should create court proceedings to be compliant with the rules, for example, or the right to access healthcare. Can you think of any other obligation of the government to uphold human rights? For example, if rights are being violated, what could you do? What can we do as an individual? Okay, so Professor, can I maybe ask you to unmute so we can hear you?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to add, but you have done that already, the right to life, because most government agencies actually kill people, and most times you find out that people die at the hands of government agencies, and there's no justice. So there should be a right to life and right to justice, and also
Correct.
there should be a right to information, because when people are denied information or the right to information, things happen and those things are carpeted. Nobody hears about them. People don't hear about what happens to others. But when people have the right to information and they have the right to give out information without fear of being followed or hunted or killed, that will also enhance the human rights. No.
Yes, that is very correct. You also have the right for information, that is correct. And for example, in China, that is not really a right, it's more a privilege, unfortunately. But the right to life, education, and to information are very important rights. And for example, that's why the role of a journalist is also very important, because they actually create information for the public and societies as well. So thank you for sharing your answer with us. That's very correct. Anyone else would like to add something? May I see you raise your hand? May I ask to unmute yourself, please?
Okay, my question is about various situations we are having in Africa, mostly part of Southern Sudan, whereby we have the cases of genocide, human atrocities. What is the United Nations umbrella doing to curb all these crises of which have been witnessed in Southern Sudan since its secession from the whole Sudan as a whole? Thank you.
Yes, so I hear you say, what happens, for example, in case of genocide or human rights being disrespected on a very severe level, right? And what can we do to force the government to be more compliant? Well, there are different things we can do, which we will discuss at the end of the presentation. But we can create, for example, more public awareness, and we can force them through political power as well to comply with the different rules. We will get there in a bit. So thank you for your answer. And if you afterwards still have a question, please let me know. But it's also still a very difficult topic, because we cannot hold the entire government accountable, and we cannot force them to be compliant. This is why we still create awareness for different human rights organizations, and for example, for the International Criminal Courts. And this is why it's so important for the different organizations to keep monitoring and reporting the incidents, to create more global awareness and to create more power with the other countries together against such a government who is oppressing human rights. Yes? Okay, thank you for your answer. So we will continue. So governments, they have a vital role, and they also have a set of obligations they should follow in upholding human rights. And the wide range of responsibilities, they are here to aim and protect and promote the fundamental rights within their jurisdiction. So what it says, for example, oh, sorry, it went too fast. Let's go back a bit. So the second one is the obligation to protect the rights, but the first one is that they are responsible for respecting and ensuring that all individuals are able to exercise their human rights without unnecessary interference or discrimination. So this basically includes the, this is like, it goes too fast. It basically means that all human rights should be recognized, and the rights of life and liberty should always be upheld. Now the question is, how do governments do this? They are actually obligated to promote and protect the rights by creating a legal framework in their country. So for example, in Europe, we have European law, but the Netherlands must comply with European regulations. And these includes laws that safeguard human rights, such as the provision for freedom of expression, but also related to data protection. And also, for example, to create fair and equal job opportunities. So governments are expected to ensure access to fair and impartial justice systems, and they should providing remedies for individuals whose rights have been violated. So they can, for example, go to human rights courts. They are also responsible for promoting human rights through various means. So you can think about education or public awareness campaigns. So this, for example, means you are entitled to create a campaign or a protest to create more awareness about a topic, for example. And it also involves the implementing measures to prevent discrimination and intolerance, which means we should focus on equality and inclusion of any type of person, regardless of their gender or their race or any other type of bias. And we should promote a culture of respect for human rights all along the world, and regardless of their sector of society they're in, because we are all still equal. So the government, they have the duty to cooperate with international human rights mechanisms, and they should also follow the rights of human rights organizations. And these includes ratifying and implementing international human rights treaties, and they should also participate in dialogue. So for example, this means that if one country is being held accountable of suppressing human rights, we can think about the Israel situation, they should participate in dialogue and they should cooperate with international bodies. Furthermore, we can also request submitting periodic reports on the status of human rights in their countries. Of course, on the other hand, we are not sure if this information is correct and accurate, because you need an extra checking body to be sure that the country is actually cooperating with international human rights, because the state might have different interests than another country, for example. So are there any cultural traditions or practices you can think of that may conflict with universal human rights principles? Because the thing is, we have human rights on one hand, but then on the other hand, we have different traditions or religions, and these can conflict with different human rights principles. So I wonder if you can think of any, and maybe what could we do to resolve such tension? Because we should also respect each other's culture, right, or habits and or practices all over the world, but they shouldn't violate human rights. So the question is, where would the border be? Like, what should be acceptable and what should not be acceptable? Where should the government where should the government interfere? Does anyone have any idea? I see one hand here. Can you unmute yourself, please? Go.
Yeah, I may say that we are on the 21st century, and I think most of the traditions which most of the nations across the world embraced be somehow be a culture that has been buried, and especially those cultures or which is various parts of Africa, and the cultures such as female circumcision, mutilations, or which society enshrines or believed in, be outdone by the educations. And I think we lack those basic cultures of which may really be or may go contrary to even going contrary from the Convention of the United Nations. I may say that.
Correct. Thank you, Carmen, for sharing your answer. You're very right. Especially the countries in Africa, for example, they have different cultural traditions. So you can think of circumcision or female mutilation. Let me get the sheet there for you. So we all have different practices, right? And we should respect the rights for different traditions or cultural habits. But the thing is, if it's going to lead to gender inequality or mutilation of the body, it could be maybe considered by other countries as a form of torture. So, for example, child labor, in some countries, this is very acceptable. In other countries, children must be minimum at the age of 12 years old in order to work. Can you maybe mute yourself so we don't hear the background noise? Thank you. So the question is, where do we limit freedoms and what could be acceptable? So these are examples of what you can think of different cultural habits and practices which could be non-compliant with different human rights. So what can we do to release tension, or what can we do to maybe find middle grounds, or how can we maybe define human rights and understand each other? So one of the things we can do is we can start opening a dialogue and we can promote education, because if we promote education, people might have a better understanding of what human rights are and also about the consequences. So if we have a better understanding about human rights principles, then we can maybe raise awareness about the harmful effects as well and the importance of human rights. We should still respect cultural sensitivity and adaptation because every country is different. So given the sensitive context of different cultural contexts, we should seek to engage with cultural norms positively. And I believe that change is more sustainable when it aligns with the local cultural values and when communities are empowered to lead the reform process. I don't think we should take it over. I think we should work together in order to find a more sustainable way and how we can define human rights. The legal frameworks is a third example what we can do to try to release tension a bit, because for example, if we create national laws to reflect and protect human rights as a standard, there might be less argument about cultural practices. Another example we could do is empower local advocates, which means that supporting local human rights, it should come from within. So basically, if you want to make a change in a specific area, it will be the most sustainable if the change is coming from the cultural group, for example, itself, instead of from something from the outside. So these are different examples. So another question of today is what role and should international organizations like the United Nations play in preventing or addressing human rights abuses, and how effective are these organizations in practice? Because that could also be a complex topic. And how can governments be held accountable? So like we discussed before today, such organizations, they monitor different incidents all over the world. They report them to the different countries. They set standards for human rights because we created different treaties, for example, on a global level. We define them. We create legal frameworks. But then the question is, what role should they play according to you, and how effective do you think they are? Can you maybe share your ideas? You can raise your hands if you would like to add something here. The question, of course, is how effective are these organizations, because they are not, it's not that like a police system in a jurisdiction itself. I don't see any hands raised yet, so we will discuss the sheet. So for example, what you can think of is that different organizations like the UN, they actually create, first of all, much more awareness. So they facilitate dialogue and cooperation. And for example, the first example you see here on the sheet is setting standards, because they create a comprehensive framework of human rights and standards. They serve as the foundation for international human rights law. But I think one of the most important ones is also that they facilitate dialogue and cooperation, because of organizations speaking out on a global level, we create more awareness and we can actually start discussing the topic all together. And because they monitor and report, we actually get more information and it becomes more transparent what's happening worldwide. Because without monitoring bodies or reporting bodies, it might be much more hard to collect and analyze data and report on human rights situations all over the world. And they actually also make recommendations to different states. So that's also very important because they provide recommendations to the states on a global level, and they do this whilst being an independent body as well, which is very important. They can also create technical assistance and capacity building. So, for example, they help by providing training for law enforcement or judicial officials, and they also support for national human rights institutions. And they can also assist in developing national action plans for human rights. So they don't only monitor and report, they also help to make the human rights be more sustainable and protected by setting up a specific framework. So how effective are they? That's actually a difficult question to answer. Because why? Well, on one hand, they create awareness and they create frameworks for human rights internationally. But on the other hand, the question is, how can they enforce human rights standards all over the world? Because states are sovereign, like we discussed before. They all have political interests and they have international different relationships they want to uphold. And the voluntary nature of compliance by states is also another question. So they do create more awareness, they do monitor and report, and they do provide assistance in strengthening human rights on a global level. And they also create reports for the states to be more compliant. But the question is, if you cannot enforce human rights on a very hard level, then how are you going to measure the effectiveness of an international human rights body? So what did we do, or what can we do to hold governments still accountable? It's still one of the most challenging aspects of international human rights law, but the mechanisms include a few of the different examples. So one of them is the ICC tribunal, like we discussed before. They can prosecute individuals for war crimes, genocides, and crimes against humanity, and they can do this on a global level. Another very important example is diplomatic pressure. So what we can do is we can exert diplomatic pressure on countries violating human rights. So we can impose different sanctions. For example, think about Russia, or we can actually suspend membership rights in international bodies as well. We can also empower civil society. So we can provide different international platforms to voice their concerns. We can also provide aid on a conditional level. So, for example, the country that is violating human rights on an international level, they must comply with our conditions in order to receive aid from countries from abroad. So while different international organizations, they play a critical role in the promotion and protection of human rights, the question is, how effective are they? Because it depends on the cooperation and the commitment of the state as well. I see one hand being raised. Kame, can you unmute yourself so we can hear you?
My question is, okay, Russia and Ukraine are part of the United Nations. Can you mention something to do with the war that is going on? And is the war still at the United Nations watchdog? And if not, then what could be happening? Because we are seeing countless violations of human rights, while already we are having a very stable, very well organized United Nations. What's not happening?
So, Kame, it's a bit difficult to hear the question because there's a lot of echo. But please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think your question is about the situation pertaining to Russia. What happens with the human rights? Because the government is violating human rights, and who can be held accountable? And the situation with Ukraine, right? So, for example, the war with Russia is quite complicated because it's becoming more and more global interfered. But we actually did impose different sanctions to the Russian government. But different states have different interests. So we are trying to protect human rights from a global level by imposing sanctions, for example, that may impact their economic situation on a negative way, or to make it more difficult to trade on an international level by taking different assets away of people who might be related to different crimes. But how we can contribute to the promotion of human rights in Russia is still a very difficult topic, because we need the cooperation and the commitment of the states and their government itself as well. So Kamle, thank you for your question. Given the time, I suggest we proceed. So we still have a few more minutes to answer any other questions you may have for today. So we have discussed the key human rights and the different international bodies, and we also discussed a few examples of violations of human rights on a global level. So my question for you today is, in what ways can you as an individual contribute to the promotion and protection of human rights globally, and how can we as an ordinary citizen, how can we make a difference? Because we can of course rely on the International Human Rights Organization, but we can also make ourselves a difference, and we can start by taking initiative. So what do you think we can do to promote more awareness and to make a difference? Do you have any idea of what we can do as a regular citizen? Kame, I see your hand raised again. You can unmute yourself. Well, Kame, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but I suggest otherwise we proceed. So how can we make a difference? There are various ways we can do this. The first of all, which is one of the most important things, like one of you told us today as well, is to educate yourself and others. Why is education so important? Because without any education, we don't maybe even know what's happening, what are human rights, what you are entitled to, and what's going on in the world. So this one is the most important one, to educate yourself and other people about what's happening and what rights you actually have. Another example is to support human rights organizations, to engage in advocacy, and you can use your vote. For example, if there's a new political party to be voted for, you can use your votes. We can stand up against discrimination. We can do this solely by ourselves, but we can also join forces and do this together. And we can engage with international efforts. So we can engage with different international protests or raise your voice, or create more awareness about what's going on a global level. And nowadays, because of the whole digitalization of the world, it's easier to create more awareness and to educate yourself, because we have much more access to information as compared to, for example, 20 years ago. So these are follow-up questions, but we can save this for another time. So I think we can recap shortly what we discussed today, and I hope you have learned the key points of the lecture. So today we discussed the human rights and the challenges and also the responses. And human rights, they exist globally and they require ongoing advocacy, but also ongoing action. Like we discussed before, human rights are still challenging to enforce and protect on a global level and on a daily basis. And we do have legal frameworks, but the question is, how can they be effective? Because we still need commitment and cooperation. And protecting human rights is very crucial for promoting equality, justice, and dignity for each and every one of you. So I hope by the end of today, you can also apply your learnings and you have a better understanding of what human rights are. So I'd like to thank you for joining today's class. And if you have any questions, I think we still have 5 minutes perhaps to discuss them. And otherwise, you can send an email and then I can reply to your email if you have any questions. Anyone still has to, would still like to ask any question? Professor, can you unmute yourself, please?
Thank you once more. Mine is a question that has almost no answer, but it's just a concern. It's a concern of the hypocrisy of the UN, because the ICC, which is an arm of enforcing human rights, is also weak. We know of some heads of state in the recent times that have been declared wanted, but nothing has happened to them. And some of them still remain members of the UN. In fact, Russia for one. And we know recently Putin was declared almost wanted. But there are friends of Russia and Putin that welcome him and move freely to those countries. And these countries are members of the UN, and they occupy the security positions in the UN. So it is a lot of hypocrisy. There doesn't seem to be readiness for establishing human rights globally. Until that time, but I see it, I lost faith in the UN because it's happening in Russia and in the Middle East. That's just my concern. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Kami, for your question. I think your question is pertaining to the situation of Russia again, right? And the United Nations, like what can we do if a member of the UN is not compliant with human rights rules and international laws? So like we discussed before, one of the things we do is to report and we monitor the incidents and we inform the specific bodies. What we can do is we can try to look for a legal solution, but then still if the state involved is not committing or cooperating, it might be more difficult to enforce these mechanisms, because we cannot, for example, hold the government itself completely accountable straight away, because these type of investigations, they take a long time. They are different to monitor and to report as well. So it's a good question you're asking, but what we can do, we can impose different sanctions, for example, to make the trading more difficult, or to make it more hard for the country to be successful in different topics or to be involved in different political situations. So those things we can do, but it's still quite difficult to completely enforce them to be compliant with human rights. I hope that answers your question. Anyone else has any other question? I think we still have time maybe for one question. Otherwise, I would like to conclude today's lecture and thank you for your time and your presence.
There is a question. Why do people in the Gaza? From Steve Copy.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
From Steve Copy, why is the UN taking so long to react to the people in the Gaza?
Why is the UN taking so long to react on the people in Gaza? Well, I don't know. I think we have to ask the UN itself, because I don't think there is any valid reason to answer this question correctly, first of all. But the thing is, with global conflicts, they're very difficult to advocate for policy changes, especially if it's related to anything ethnical or religious, or it's been going on for many, many years. So for example, in the Middle East as well, like so many different conflicts have been there for years or even centuries. which makes it very difficult for different bodies to interfere, because even if they interfere, they might suppress against another policy of a country, a neighboring country, for example. So it's difficult to interfere and to find a correct answer to interfere at all. And secondly, it's difficult to ensure you have the correct and accurate information. And if the bodies or the governments don't want to work with you, it's going to be more difficult for them to cooperate as well. So even if they interfere, if the political bodies in that country are not determined to make a change themselves either, it might not be successful on the long term. So it's not only the question, when do people interfere, it's also how can you interfere on a more sustainable way and create as little victims as you can.